Mark had it all: success, wealth, and a loving wife. But when she was diagnosed with cancer, he made the unforgivable decision to leave her for a new lover. However, his wife's final, heartbreaking request forced him to face the truth of his betrayal. What happens when guilt and regret come crashing down on a man who thought he could escape the consequences of his actions? Rachel and Mark's story began like so many love stories do, with dreams of a better future and a commitment to each other that would withstand the tests of time. They were both young, ambitious, and eager to conquer the world together. Their love, built on shared experiences and mutual respect, quickly grew into something extraordinary. From their first days in a modest apartment to the expansive home they later built together, it was clear that they were a team. Mark's business began to take off, fueled by his ambition and hard work, while Rachel stood by his side managing their home and supporting his every move. But it wasn't just success they were building, it was a life. They traveled the world, enjoyed dinners in the finest restaurants, and made memories that would last a lifetime. They laughed, they fought, but most importantly, they loved. Their relationship wasn't without challenges, but each obstacle they faced only strengthened the bond they shared. They thought they had it all, and in many ways, they did. Yet, as the years passed, something began to change. Mark became more consumed with his business, spending longer hours at the office, attending endless meetings, and constantly chasing the next big deal. Rachel, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin, was no longer his first priority. Slowly but surely, she began to feel the distance between them. She tried to hold on to the life they once had, but she could see it slipping away, and the man she had loved so deeply seemed further and further out of reach. It wasn't just the long hours or the increasing distance between them. It was the way Mark seemed to lose himself in his success. He was no longer the man who had promised to love her through everything. Rachel knew she was losing him, but she didn't know how to bring him back. All she had was her unwavering love for him, even as he seemed more interested in the next project, the next achievement, than in the woman who had been his rock. Their world, once so full of love and promise, now seemed uncertain. Rachel began to wonder if the life they had built together was truly enough to hold Mark's attention anymore. Was their love strong enough to withstand the pressures of success and the strain that came with it? As she lay awake at night, watching the man she loved drift further away, Rachel couldn't help but fear that the distance between them might be too much to overcome. And little did they know, the answer to that question would come sooner than they expected, and it would change everything. Rachel had always been the beating heart of their home, the woman who stood by Mark's side through every triumph. But now, as she sat in the doctor's office listening to the words, "Stage 4 cancer," everything she had ever known crumbled. The world she had carefully built with Mark, their future, their dreams, suddenly seemed out of reach. In that moment, her life was shattered beyond repair. The doctors spoke, but she couldn't hear them. Her mind raced, filled with fear and disbelief. Mark had always been there for her, but she could see it in his eyes. He was scared too, not just for her, but for their future. The diagnosis changed everything. Rachel's once healthy body was now a battleground. The life she had so carefully built with Mark, the plans, the dreams, they all seemed so distant now. The thought of losing it all, of losing him, overwhelmed her. But she knew that she couldn't give up. She wouldn't let this disease take away everything they had fought for. At home, Mark tried to act strong, but Rachel could see through his facade. The worry etched on his face was impossible to hide. As he buried himself in his work, spending less time at home, Rachel could feel the growing void between them. She needed him more than ever, but the distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She realized that even though her body was failing her, the love she desperately needed was slipping away just as fast. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He couldn't handle the thought of losing her. As the days turned into weeks, the reality of the diagnosis set in. Mark began to pull away even more. He was afraid afraid of watching his wife deteriorate, afraid of what would happen to him, to them. His escape was work, and his love for Rachel started to feel like a memory of a time when things were simpler, before cancer took over their lives. But Rachel wasn't giving up. She couldn't. She loved him too much. Rachel's world, once full of hope and possibility, was now filled with doctor's appointments, medications, and the constant fear of what each day might bring. She tried to hold on, tried to keep her faith, but as her health deteriorated, it became harder to pretend that everything was okay. The Mark she had known, the man who had always been by her side, was slipping away, and she couldn't stop it. Mark never imagined that he would find solace in the arms of someone else, especially not while Rachel was fighting for her life. But as the months went by, the pressure and emotional toll of her illness became too much. He was tired of watching her suffer, tired of feeling helpless, and most of all, tired of the weight of it all. Then came Sophie. Sophie represented everything Rachel could no longer be: youth, energy, and a sense of freedom that Mark had desperately craved. Their first encounter was innocent enough, but as Mark began to confide in her more, the lines between right and wrong began to blur. What started as an innocent distraction soon turned into a dangerous, uncontrollable affair. Mark was no longer just escaping his pain. He was losing himself in it. Sophie became Mark's escape from the harsh reality of his wife's illness. With her, he could forget the pain, the constant hospital visits, and the growing sadness that followed him everywhere he went. What began as a fling quickly escalated into a full-blown affair. Mark justified it to himself. He deserved this. He deserved to feel alive again. Rachel would never know, he convinced himself. It was a moment of weakness, nothing more. But as the weeks turned into months, Mark's feelings for Sophie deepened. She didn't ask anything of him, didn't need him to be anything but the man he was right now. The guilt, at first overwhelming, started to fade as he became more consumed by his new relationship. But deep inside, Mark knew this couldn't last. He was betraying the woman who had been his everything for so long. Rachel was fighting a battle she couldn't win, and Mark was losing himself in someone else. He was trapped in a world of lies, torn between the woman he had vowed to spend his life with and the woman who made him feel wanted again. As much as he tried to convince himself that Sophie was just a distraction, he couldn't deny the growing connection between them. He had begun to feel something real for her. Sophie brought him joy, something he hadn't felt in a long time. She made him feel whole again, something he had almost forgotten was possible. But he knew deep down that this was just a temporary escape. Rachel's diagnosis was still looming, and nothing would change that. Yet, Mark couldn't help but wonder if this was what he truly wanted. The affair had given him something he thought he had lost: hope. It was a fleeting hope, but in a world that felt broken, it was all he had left. Rachel had known for a while that something was wrong. She could see the distance between them growing, feel the coldness creeping into their once warm relationship. But it wasn't until that fateful evening when Mark's phone rang, and she saw Sophie's name light up the screen, that the truth hit her. The betrayal was no longer a whisper. It was a scream she could no longer ignore. The reality of it all settled in like a heavy weight on her chest. Mark wasn't just distant, he had been living a lie. He had been with someone else, someone who wasn't her. Her mind raced, filled with 1,000 questions. How long had this been going on? How could he do this to her, to their life together? But the biggest question of all was one she couldn't answer. Why had he chosen her? Mark tried to explain, but words felt hollow. He apologized, of course. He told her it was a mistake, that it was just a distraction, that he was sorry for the hurt he caused. But Rachel couldn't hear him anymore. She had always been the one who supported him, who loved him unconditionally, and now she was left with nothing but his empty promises and his betrayal. The woman who had been by his side through thick and thin, the woman who had given him everything, was now nothing more than a shadow in his eyes. And in that moment, Rachel realized that the man she had loved had been slipping away long before the affair began. It wasn't just the physical betrayal that hurt. It was the emotional abandonment. He had given up on her, on them, long before he ever laid eyes on Sophie. As the reality of the betrayal sank in, Rachel's heart shattered. The man she thought she knew, the man she had built a life with, was no longer the same. He had chosen someone else, and nothing she said or did could change that. She had given him everything, but in the end, it wasn't enough. And as she looked into his eyes, she knew that their love, the love she had fought so hard to keep, was gone. But it was too late. He had already chosen his path, and Rachel was left to pick up the broken pieces of her heart, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Rachel sat quietly, her heart a whirlwind of emotions, as Mark stood there, unable to look her in the eye. The betrayal had been exposed, and now the truth was undeniable. The man she had loved with all her heart was no longer the person she thought he was. He was someone else, someone who had chosen to walk away from everything they had built together. The silence between them was deafening. Mark tried to speak, to offer some explanation, but Rachel couldn't listen anymore. She had heard it all before, empty apologies, excuses, promises that meant nothing now. The woman who had stood by him through every trial, every challenge, was now nothing more than a distant memory. And Mark? He had made his choice. He had already chosen Sophie, and there was no going back. As Rachel stood in the quiet of their home, the weight of it all crashed down on her. The life they had once shared, the love they had built together, was slipping through her fingers. She had fought so hard to keep it all together, to hold on to the man she once knew. But it was clear now. He was gone. The future they had planned, the dreams they had shared, were now just fragments of a past that no longer existed. Mark's decision to leave was not just about Sophie. It was about everything they had lost along the way. It was about the years of neglect, the growing distance, the way he had slowly slipped away from her, emotionally and physically. His actions had shattered her heart, and now he was walking away, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a life she no longer recognized. As Mark gathered his things, preparing to leave, Rachel's mind raced. She wanted to scream, to beg him to stay, to remind him of all the good times they had shared. But deep down, she knew it was too late. The love she had once cherished was gone, replaced by betrayal and heartache. Mark walked out the door, leaving behind the woman who had given him everything. Rachel stood there, her tears falling silently, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. As the door closed behind him, a finality settled in her heart. She was alone now, and the life they had once shared was no more. She had to accept that everything had changed, and that her world, once full of hope, was now filled with the echoes of what could have been. Rachel had known for some time that her time was running out. The doctors had made it clear. There was no more hope, only days, maybe weeks at best. But even as her body failed her, Rachel's mind remained sharp. She had lived a life full of love, but now she was faced with the hardest decision of all: how to say goodbye. It wasn't just the illness that had broken her, it was the betrayal that had shattered her heart. Mark's decision to leave her for Sophie had left a deep scar, one that would never fully heal. But Rachel, ever the strong woman, had a final wish, one that had nothing to do with the pain she had endured. She wanted to leave this world with dignity, with her love for Mark still intact, and with one final act that would bring them back to the beginning of their journey together. As Mark sat by her bedside, his face full of guilt and regret, Rachel reached out to him, her frail hand trembling. She looked into his eyes and asked him for something simple, yet profound. "Take me to the place where we first met," she whispered. "Take me back to where we began, before all the pain, before everything changed." Mark was stunned. He had expected Rachel to be angry, to scream at him for what he had done, but instead she was calm, almost peaceful in her request. He didn't know what to say. How could he grant her final wish when he knew he had destroyed everything they had built together? But Rachel was not asking for vengeance or an apology. She was asking for closure, for both of them. It was a strange request, one that seemed out of place in the midst of such pain. But Rachel's last wish was not about revisiting the past. It was about letting go of the future. She wanted to remember the love they had shared, the good times, the happiness. She wanted to die knowing that, despite everything, she had loved deeply and truly. Mark, after a long silence, nodded. He promised her that he would fulfill her last wish. He took her hand and kissed her gently, knowing that, no matter how much he regretted his actions, this was the final chance to make things right. For Rachel, it wasn't about finding peace with Mark. It was about finding peace within herself. Her wish, simple and poignant, would be the last gift he could give her. It was a request that would close the chapter of their love, a final act that would linger in his heart forever. Mark sat in the dimly lit room, his mind racing. He had just promised Rachel that he would take her to the place where they first met, to fulfill her final wish. But as he sat there, looking at her fragile form, he couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that gripped him. How had he gotten to this point? How had he let it all slip away? The affair with Sophie had started as an escape, a moment of weakness in a time of despair. But it had turned into something much more complicated. He had convinced himself that it was just a distraction, that he needed this to cope with Rachel's illness. But now, in the silence of the room, with Rachel's wish hanging in the air, Mark was forced to confront the truth. His actions had destroyed everything he had ever loved. He had betrayed the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin. He had abandoned her when she needed him most. Mark knew he had made the wrong choice, but the weight of his decisions was too heavy to bear. He had chosen Sophie, but that choice had come at a devastating cost. The love he once shared with Rachel was now gone, replaced by guilt and regret. He had been so consumed by his own fears and desires that he had failed to see the woman he had loved slipping away. And now she was asking for his help, asking for something he could never undo. The thought of taking Rachel to their special place, the place where everything began, felt like a cruel irony. He had lost her, and now he was trying to hold on to what was left. But as he looked at her, weak and vulnerable, Mark realized that this was his last chance to make things right. He couldn't change the past, but he could fulfill her last wish. He could at least give her the closure she deserved. Mark found himself torn. Could he live with the guilt of what he had done? Could he face Rachel knowing that he had betrayed her trust, that he had let her down in the worst way possible? The battle inside him raged on, a war between his regret and his desire to do the right thing. The man who had once been so sure of himself was now a shell of his former self, broken by the weight of his actions. He knew that taking her to that place wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't fix the damage he had done, but it was all he had left, a small act of redemption in a life filled with mistakes. And so, with a heavy heart, Mark made the decision. He would take her there, to the place where it all began, and he would do it for her, not for himself. Mark stood at the edge of the familiar place, his heart heavy with regret and guilt. The memories flooded back the moment his eyes scanned the surroundings. It was the place where it all began, the place where he and Rachel had first met, where their love had blossomed. This was the beginning of their journey together, a time when their future seemed so certain, so full of promise. Now, standing here, Mark couldn't help but feel the weight of the years, the mistakes, and the betrayal. Rachel's last wish had brought him back here, to this moment, to relive the past that now felt so distant and unreachable. He had promised her he would bring her to this place, but as he stood there alone, without her by his side, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was too little, too late. The woman he had once known was gone, and the love they had shared was now just a painful memory. The place looked the same as it had years ago, unchanged by time, but everything around him felt different. The laughter, the joy, the hope, they had all been replaced by silence and regret. He had taken so much for granted, assuming that love would always be enough, that their bond was unbreakable. But now, standing here, he realized how wrong he had been. The foundation they had built together had cracked under the weight of his choices. Mark closed his eyes, trying to remember the feeling of their first kiss, the first time they held hands, the first time they whispered their dreams to each other. It all seemed so distant, as if it had happened in another lifetime. The woman he had once loved with all his heart was now gone, and all that remained was the echo of their past. The regret that gnawed at him grew stronger with every passing second. He could have done things differently. He could have been there for Rachel when she needed him the most. He could have fought for their love, for their future. But instead he had chosen a different path, one that had led him to this moment, this place, where everything seemed to unravel. And yet, despite everything, he felt a strange sense of peace. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the pain he had caused. But in this moment, he could remember the good times, the love, the joy, the dreams they had shared. For the first time in a long time, Mark allowed himself to feel the warmth of those memories, knowing that no matter how much he had lost, they would always be a part of him. Mark's mind was consumed with guilt as he walked away from the place that had once held so many happy memories. The weight of his actions was suffocating, and the realization that he had lost everything began to settle in. His life with Rachel, the woman he had promised to love forever, was gone. And in its place was a deep, unshakable emptiness that he didn't know how to fill. He had made the wrong choices, and now there was no going back. The affair, the lies, the distance, it had all led him here, standing alone in the cold, empty reality of his own making. Sophie was no longer the answer, and Rachel was no longer there to forgive him. The love he had once felt was now a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of regret. Mark had thought that by walking away from Rachel, he would be freeing himself from the pain of her illness, but in reality, he had only condemned himself to a lifetime of regret. He had chosen the easy way out, the escape, but now he was paying the price. The truth was clear to him now. There was no escaping the consequences of his actions. The weight of what he had done hung over him like a dark cloud. He could try to ignore it, try to move on, but he knew that the guilt would always be there, a constant reminder of what he had lost. Rachel's last wish had forced him to confront the truth. He had been a coward, too afraid to face the difficult reality of her illness and their relationship. He had chosen selfishly, and now, in the silence of his own mind, he was paying the price. Mark's heart twisted in agony as he faced the undeniable truth. There was no way to undo what he had done. The damage was done, and no apology, no action could ever fix it. Redemption felt out of reach, slipping through his fingers as the weight of his choices bore down on him. He could feel the cold grip of regret tightening around his chest, suffocating him. The consequences of his actions were irreversible, and he was left with nothing but the ruins of a life he had destroyed. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He had failed her. He had failed them both. He had failed the woman who had given him everything, and now he was left to live with that truth. As the days passed and the weight of his mistakes crushed him, Mark knew that he would never be the same. He could never go back to who he once was. The love he had for Rachel, now buried beneath the regret and the pain, would always be a reminder of what he had lost. The realization that he could never undo the past haunted him every waking moment, and with it came the bitter taste of regret that would linger for the rest of his life. The weight of Mark's decisions lingered long after he had left the place that once meant so much to him and Rachel. His mind was still trapped in the guilt, replaying every moment, every mistake, every decision that had led him to this moment. No matter how much he tried to move forward, he couldn't escape the past. He had betrayed Rachel, and now, no matter how hard he tried, nothing seemed right. Sophie, once a source of comfort, now seemed like a hollow presence in his life. The affair had been an escape, a brief distraction from the harsh reality of his marriage, but now it felt meaningless. He had thought that leaving Rachel would bring him peace, but instead, it had only left him with an emptiness he couldn't fill. Every time he looked at Sophie, he saw Rachel's face, her disappointment, her pain. the love he had once thrown away. Rachel was gone, and he couldn't change that. He had chosen to walk away when she needed him the most, and now she was no longer there to forgive him. Mark had tried to escape the consequences of his actions, but they were unavoidable. The pain he had caused was deep, and it would follow him forever. He couldn't fix what he had broken, couldn't undo the damage. And as the days passed, the consequences of his choices became clearer. He had lost the one person who had loved him unconditionally, the woman who had been his partner in every sense of the word. And now, as he stood alone in the life he had built without her, Mark realized that he had truly lost everything. His success, his wealth, the woman he thought could replace Rachel, all of it seemed insignificant compared to the one thing he had truly wanted: redemption. Mark's life, once filled with promise, was now a life of regret. He had everything he could have ever wanted: wealth, success, and the love of a woman who had stood by him for years. But in his pursuit of it all, he had lost the one thing that truly mattered. Now, standing in the silence of his own mistakes, Mark knew that nothing could fix the broken pieces of his life. But as he sat alone in the darkness, a letter arrived. It was from Rachel, a final letter that she had written before she passed away. Mark's hands trembled as he opened it, not knowing what to expect. As he read her words, he felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Rachel, in her final moments, had forgiven him. She had understood that he had been consumed by fear, that he had made a mistake, but she wanted him to know that she still loved him. The letter was not just a message of forgiveness, it was a message of redemption. But just as the weight of her forgiveness began to sink in, Mark saw the final line of the letter. "Don't wait too long, Mark. The time to make things right is now, or it will be too late." It was a warning, a final plea for him to stop running from his mistakes, to face them head on, and to find peace before it was too late. With the letter in his trembling hands, Mark stood up, not knowing what to expect next. Rachel's forgiveness was a bittersweet gift, but it didn't erase the damage he had caused. For the first time in a long while, he found the courage to face the consequences. But deep down, he knew the hope he clung to was the cruelest illusion of all. It was too late for redemption.